The ranch was always quiet at dawn, the kind of quiet that pressed against a man's ears until he could hear his own heartbeat. And Samuel? Crow liked it that way because silence had never betrayed him the way people had. For 20 years he had run the Crow Ranch on the far edge of Carson County, a stretch of dry land most folks avoided. And during those years he'd learned to speak little, observe much, and trust actions over words. That was why, on that cold morning when he stepped out of his house with a cup of black coffee and saw Maria Alvarez crossing the yard with a limp that hadn't been there the day before, something inside him tightened. Maria was his maid, though the word never sat right with him. She cleaned, cooked, kept the old ranch house alive, and did it with a quiet dignity that matched his own. She was young, no more than 24, strong as wire, and proud enough to hide pain behind a polite smile, which was exactly what she tried to do when she noticed him watching. She straightened her back, took another step, and nearly fell. Samuel moved without thinking, the coffee forgotten as it spilled onto the dirt, his long strides closing the distance before she could protest. Up close he saw what distance had hidden, her ankles swollen, bruises creeping up her calf like dark fingerprints, her hands shaking as she leaned on the porch post. She said it was nothing, said she'd twisted it, said she'd be fine. But Samuel had grown up with brothers who lied about broken bones and men who lied about worse, and he knew the sound of fear when he heard it. He asked her who did it quietly, not raising his voice, not accusing, just asking, and when she flinched at the question, his jaw tightened in a way that meant something had crossed, a line that could not be uncrossed. Maria tried to brush past him, but he blocked her path with a gentleness that allowed no argument, guiding her to the porch chair and kneeling to look at her ankle. The bruises weren't from a fall. They were too even, too deliberate, and when he rolled up her sleeve to check for more, she pulled away too fast, the sleeve slipping just enough for him to see the marks on her wrist. That was when the quiet ranch seemed to hold its breath. Maria whispered that she didn't want trouble, that she needed the job, that things would only get worse if she talked, and Samuel listened, truly listened, because he knew that kind of fear too. He stood, went inside without a word, returned with a first aid kit, wrapped her ankle carefully, and told her she was taking the day off. When she protested, he shook his head once, firm, the same way he did with stubborn horses. He said he'd drive her home, and when she said no again, said her brother would be angry. Samuel's eyes hardened not with rage but with resolve. He told her he'd already called the sheriff. The color drained from her face, and she begged him not to, her voice cracking as she confessed that it wasn't her brother but the man her brother owed money to, a man named Carl Denton who worked security for the county and liked to remind people that badges had a way of protecting their own. Samuel said nothing as she spoke, but something ancient and unyielding settled into his chest, because bullies had always relied on silence, and he had been silent long enough in his life. He drove her home anyway, ignoring her fear, ignoring the looks from neighbors who knew better than to ask questions, and when he returned to the ranch, he didn't go back to work. He went to the barn, opened an old lockbox, and pulled out papers he hadn't touched in years, deeds, contracts, receipts, and a battered notebook filled with dates and names from a time when he'd helped the sheriff's office quietly, unofficially, tracking rustlers and traffickers who thought remote land meant no witnesses. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Samuel Crow was no longer just a quiet rancher concerned about his maid. He was a man preparing to step into a storm. When the sheriff arrived, expecting a simple domestic complaint that could be smoothed over, he found Samuel waiting on the porch, calm, polite, and holding evidence that tied Carl Denton to far more than a single act of violence. As the sheriff read, his expression shifted from boredom to disbelief to something like fear, and when he asked Samuel where he'd gotten it all, Samuel simply said he'd been watching for a long time. By nightfall, word spread fast through Carson County that the Crow Ranch was no longer a place to test boundaries, and inside the sheriff's office, phones rang, files were pulled, and a man who thought himself untouchable realized too late that hurting a limping young woman had woken something far more dangerous than law enforcement. And as the first arrest was made, Samuel stood alone on his porch again, the quiet returning, knowing this was only the beginning, because some silences were meant to be broken. And if you want to know how far this went, how the sheriff's office was shaken to its core, and what happened to Maria when the truth finally came out, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because Chapter 2 will reveal everything that followed.